Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
The Scramble for Africa, Part 2. We're going to talk about what is happening in Africa recently, which is quite a lot of upheaval in politics and in countries. Governments are falling one right after the other. Where are the geopolitical dominoes going, and what might they have to do with big macroeconomic trends that will be with us for a decade or longer? And how might they affect financial markets? My name is Emil Kalinowski, and I am broadcasting to you live from the studios of Radio Cayman on 89.9 in Grand Cayman and 93.9 in Cayman Brac and Little Cayman, and of course, online, worldwide, maybe even interstellar, at YouTube on the Radio Cayman YouTube channel. You've got to go there not only just for this show, but all the shows that will be on all day long. Again, my name is Emil Kalinowski, and I am, I do work in the metals and mining industry, and some very interesting things are happening in the metals and mining industry right now. International, not just boring supply and demand, blah. Who cares about fundamentals when we can talk about international affairs, the Chinese, the Russians, the Americans, what's going on? Okay, the Scramble for Africa was, the first time around, a colonial pursuit by Europe as they went to Africa and took over large swaths of territory and said, this is ours, and we're going to take the resources and people from here. And the countries of Europe competed for it. Fast forward 100 years, World War II is over, and independence takes place. A great push for independence across Africa takes place in the 1950s and 60s, for better or for worse, perhaps even in some ways for worse. I read a fantastic book called The Tears of Africa, I believe. It was by Martin Meredith, and he went over country by country what has happened since independence in Africa, and it's not wonderful, always not wonderful. But some countries made it on their own 2 feet, have been managing, and I would say during the Cold War, the West, Europe, was still heavily involved in what was happening in Africa, because there was a worldwide war. Even though it was cold, there was a worldwide war taking place. And the powers, the great powers, the Soviet Union, the United States, they had to have everyone either on their team or ostensibly neutral. Well, Cold War ended, 1991, and Africa's been left to its own devices. And then in the early 1990s, Francis Fukuyama wrote an essay. And who is he? He's, forgive me, is he Taiwanese American or Japanese American? Big difference, but forgive me, I forget which one. I think he's Japanese American, and he wrote a famous essay called The End of History. And it was so hopeful. It meant that America won the Cold War, and we're not going to have to worry about it because we see how wonderful it is. Liberal capitalist democracy. Isn't this nice? And for the 1990s it was. And maybe the 2000s. But then slowly but surely the end of history turned out to have been an illusion, as it always has been, because there's nothing new under the sun, and we as humans always fall into the same traps, the same behavior. It's our nature. And here we are again. Great power politics has come back. The tragedy of it has come back. But this time, there's some new players. China has been in Africa for quite some period of time, investing heavily to harvest the minerals, the metals from those nations. And China has built up a fabulous head start on the rest of the world. Why? Because Beijing subsidizes their energy. And what do you need energy for? You need it for processing. So many of the minerals around the world, copper, let's see, what else can we say? Nickel, zinc, all manner of base metals, tin, that we use for our day-to-day lives, for our construction, for our cars, for manufacturing, as well as for electronics. Fancy things such as gallium and germanium that we've never heard of, and rare earth elements that China controls that we use in our microchips and advanced technologies. Well, it's very dirty to process them. You need a lot of heat. Means you need a lot of energy, and you put out a lot of smoke and a lot of pollution and a slag and externalities and just things. What would we call it? Just all that ore that you ship to China. Not all of it is metal. A lot of it is just rock, and you melt it, and it's disgusting, and it's foamy. And what do you want to do that in Europe? Beautiful Paris? No. Are you going to do that in the United States? No. So, Team West, the advanced economy, said, we're going to send all of this to you, China, because we're all on the same team. The Cold War is over. The end of history. We're all on the same team. You will get wealthy because you will do all the processing, and our environment will be clean, and everyone will be happy because we're all on the same team. There were these crotchety, old, wise individuals who believed in realpolitik, and they said, this is crazy. We're sending all our industrial know-how over there. We're not on the same team. And everyone said, well, what? You're so pessimistic. You're so negative. Why can't you believe in the beautiful fraternity of a future where we're all one group, all one humanity? I guess they haven't read their history. Well, things have started turning south. They started in 2008. We had a global financial crisis, but maybe not everyone knows, but in 2008, NATO met in Bucharest in April, and they said, we are going to invite Georgia, not the American state, but the international state it's between Iran and Turkey and Iraq. It's very hard to know where it's located, but it's on the outer edges of Russia, where Turkey and the Middle East meet. And so Georgia and Ukraine, we're going to invite them to NATO. That was in April. In August, Russia invaded Georgia because they're not going to stand for NATO being right on their border. And here we are again. Russia's invaded the Ukraine. Ever since 2008, things have been going the wrong way. We've gone from cooperation to competition. But only recently did Team West clue in to what Russia and China knew all along. So China has been buying up minerals and making deals in Africa for a very long time. All those commodities have been heading to China. Now we have to pay China for refined metals, and we are at their behest. We are counting on them. We are relying on them for these critical raw materials for our economy. Similar things with Russia. Both China and Russia deliver a tremendous amount of raw goods, raw metals to the rest of the world. Aluminum, for example, 65% of it comes from China and Russia. Steel, 56% come from those two countries. Copper, refined copper, 50%. Zinc, just under 50%. We can go on and on and on. So, what clarified Team West's what clarified their view of the future was the arrival of Donald Trump in the United States. He was very anti-globalization and anti-China, and he said, we're not going to stand for this anymore. But a lot of people said that Donald Trump is very orange, and therefore you can't take him seriously. He's orange. How can we listen to this person? But then President Biden comes in, and turns out he's not orange, and he's saying the very same things. In fact, the Americans, the only thing the Republicans and Democrats can agree on over there is that they're worried about China. It turns out the Europeans are as well. And then once the COVID and government shutdowns hit, and we saw how fragile our supply chains were, well, the scales were finally off the eyes of Team West. And finally, Team West is now participating in the scramble for Africa. It's taking place everywhere, but it's very acute in Africa right now. Now, what is taking place specifically? Perhaps you haven't heard, but there was a coup in Africa. Coup, C-O-O? No, C-O-U-P, coup, an overthrow. Somebody said, I don't like the way you're running this country, and I'm going to take over. And usually it's the military that does this. Now, which coup am I referring to? Good question. There's so many of them, it's hard to keep track. Since 2020, there have been 2020. Since 2020, there have been successful Burkina coups in Burkina Faso 2 times, in Chad, Guinea, Mali 2 times in Mali, Sudan, Niger. There have been several more that have failed in the Central African Republic, Djibouti, Guinea-Bissau. Oh gosh, I'm sorry, I didn't pronounce that one right. Madagascar, and these are my favorite, possibly 2 coups in Gambia and Sao Tome Principe. Oh, forgive me, I can't pronounce those countries. My favorite part about those possible coups is that the government announced one day, we have arrested 4 individuals. They were trying to overthrow a government. Both of them said that they arrested 4 individuals. Gambia, November 2020. 2022, they said we've arrested 4 individuals. And then 1 month later in December, Sao Tome Principe said we've arrested 4 individuals as well. No word whether or not it was the same 4 individuals. No doubt it wasn't. And that does not include Gabon, which just had a coup last week. This is remarkable, ladies and gentlemen. One right after another. And if you haven't noticed, who has benefited from these coups one right after the other? Russia. Out of nowhere, the Russians have all of a sudden ingratiated themselves with these countries in the Sahara. There's a region called the Sahel. In the Sahel, that's where all the Islamic fundamentalists have been pushed. They've generally been pushed out of the Middle East, and now they've been pushed into the Sahara region that stretches from the east in Sudan all the way to the west in Mali, and that's where they're operating. The Islamic State, the Al-Qaeda, and they're battling the governments. The governments are not doing very well, so the military kicks out the government and then says, we're going to battle the insurgents, the jihadis. And guess what? We're also going to kick out the French because we don't particularly care for them. And we're going to kick out possibly maybe the Americans. I don't know. That's a possibility. This last week there was huge protests in front of a French embassy in Burkina Faso because the government there that was overthrown for the second time said that the French ambassador is no longer welcome. Why? The Russians have been instigating, have been spreading, have been fanning messages, news, propaganda that says the French are lousy people, colonialists, and they don't belong there. Now, why should we be concerned about what's happening in those countries beyond humanitarian reasons? These countries are exporters of natural resources. Niger sends uranium and gold into the world. Gold, copper, petroleum, iron ore, ferroalloys, nickel, manganese. These are all metals that are on critical mineral lists that governments have put together and are urgently promoting the desire to control the supply chains for these metals. They're very interested in getting them, securing them, not just for green energy, but for military purposes. Meanwhile, these countries are being overthrown, and they're falling into the favor of Russia, and already they're being paid by China. Is Team West falling farther behind? What's the reaction going to be by Team West? How's it going to affect markets? We're going to talk about that after this break.
Radio Cayman, maintaining the innovation.
On a daily basis, making it easy to connect with you, our listeners. Add us to WhatsApp today, 925-3261. That's 925-3261.
Radio Cayman.
Send a text or voice note.
Can I send a request, please?
You don't really have to ask us. Just send a request.
This is a shout out to my ex.
Radio Cayman, the voice of the Cayman Islands.
Radio Cayman, maintaining the innovation.
This is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community. Brought to you by the CFA Society Cayman Islands.
And now, more Money Sense.
Welcome back, everyone. My name is Emil Kalinowski, and today we're talking about geopolitics in Africa, a scramble for Africa, how Russia's gained a tremendous amount of leverage in a very short time as coup after coup is overthrowing governments in Africa. China has been there the whole time. Team West is only just waking up. They're only just now joining the scramble for minerals. How's that going to affect potential markets, investments that we can make? It's going to affect the metals and mining industry. Now, in the first part, we talked about that China and Russia are already there as state actors. Sure, they have government, they have companies that are working there, including mercenaries. You may have heard that 2 weeks ago, the Russian warlord had a mysterious death, a mysterious plane crash. That was about a month or two after he tried to overthrow, seemingly, President Putin in Russia. And now he apparently is dead. What was Wagner doing? Wagner was the paramilitary mercenary force that he was operating, the person that died in that plane crash. He was in Africa supplying weapons to these governments who are battling the jihadis, and they were supplying weapons, no questions asked. All they wanted in return was gold. Some fabulous stories, incredible stories coming out of the reporting from the Wall Street Journal recently about the last days of this Russian warlord, how he spent it in Africa, gathering gold. Incredible. From Sudan, from the Central African Republic, from Mali, home of Mansa Musa, one of the richest people in history, from Timbuktu, the lost mine of Ophir, Solomon's lost mine of Ophir, may have been in Mali. So there's gold everywhere. Russia is working. They're working using paramilitary forces. They're using their government. The Chinese not using paramilitary forces, but companies. And now the West is finally going to step in, and there's going to be a scramble for these minerals and metals. How do we know this? Well, we know this because the chief executives of metals and mining companies are saying to the government, we need you to step in. We need you to support us. That's a very big change that we're going to be going through for the next decade, maybe generation or two. We're going to be leaving the laissez-faire 1980s, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, free market economics world, and we're going to be returning to the 1930s to 1970s, dirigiste, government intervention, heavy state planning that the West was very comfortable with or very used to for that entire period. Now in Asia, this still takes place, but in the West, we've had free market economics, but we're going back. And one of the places where you can expect to see heavy government intervention is the metals and mining industry, meaning support. For better or for worse, the government will be getting involved. Right now, they will be getting involved by supporting the mining industry. And the CEOs are calling on their governments. Just recently, just this summer, Rio Tinto, an Australian and British, but Australian mining company, said that China is in a very good position because they've planned for it. And now the West is starting to do what China has historically always done, which is what? Government support of their metals and mining companies. Lynas Rare Earths, which has for over a decade battled Beijing to develop rare earth metals. Called their CEO, Amanda Lacaze, asked for straight up industry planning from the government. Now, they're not the only ones. A couple of weeks ago, I think maybe a month ago, I was on the airwaves here with you, and I informed you that Eramet, a company from France that's been in business for almost 150 years, they're a miner, and they said that they had to partner with a Chinese company because the European Union didn't provide the support they needed. They called on the European Union to provide loans, equity participation, and all the funding instruments we can get, not just Eramet, but the industry. The Director of Corporate Affairs said that we are looking for the EU to not suffer from a lack of financing to develop our projects. It's because of the lack of financial support from Europe that we further developed our partnership with Tsingshan, which is a Chinese company. Now, Team West is finally waking up to this. A few months ago, there was a major mining conference in Africa called Mining Indaba, and it was acknowledged at that point that America's decision to allow a U.S. firm to sell one of Congo's largest copper cobalt mines to a Chinese company in 2020 is now seen in Washington as an enormous act of stupidity. So you see how fast it's changed, how fast the pivot is taking place, how fast government is getting involved. Just 3 years ago, Washington said, sure, sell this copper cobalt mine to a Chinese company. There's no problem with that. 3 years later, they realized what a tremendous mistake that was. And they're obviously not going to be doing that. They're going to be getting involved. How involved? The United States government, the British government, have invested in a lithium project in Britain. This is very unusual. Why would the United Kingdom Infrastructure Bank and the United States Development Finance Corporation be investing in lithium mining in Britain? Because they want to make sure that they can get this raw mineral from a friendly jurisdiction. Now, they're only just getting started. You may have heard the term unicorn, a unicorn. That's talked about usually when we're talking about Silicon Valley and artificial intelligence and fancy electronics. It's a small company that all of a sudden becomes worth $1 billion on the stock market exchange. Did you know that TechMet, a U.S. company that is investing in nickel, cobalt, lithium, graphite, vanadium, rare earths, and tin is so boring, I don't know why they are, is almost about to be worth $1 billion and is going to be a mining unicorn. Now, why is this unusual, ladies and gentlemen? It's a U.S. government startup. The U.S. government has decided to fund this company, kickstart it, and have it start investing in metals. Companies are also starting to invest in processing all across Africa as well. Processing, not just getting the ore, but also refining it. Because they don't want to do it in Japan, they don't want to do it in the United States or Europe because they still think it's dirty. So where else are they going to do it? They're going to be doing it in South America and Africa. So this is the context of what is taking place. This is why, surely, these coups are taking place one right after another in Africa, because there is a shift, a geopolitical shift taking place. And surely these individuals realize that if you can get to the top of your political institution in that particular country, surely you'll be able to reap some of the rewards in the coming decades. Get quick, get rich. Not get rich quick, but quick. Grab the wealth while you can. So Tanzania, for example, hopes to be producing battery-grade refined nickel by 2026, courtesy of an Australian-managed mine and American-operated refinery. Zambia going to have a cobalt refinery. Madagascar, a graphite mine. Mauritius is going to be processing all of those. And where is all that coming from? British funding. South Africa hopes to be a lithium-ion battery-grade processing facility. And who's building it? An American company. So you can see where the wind is blowing. It's blowing in the direction of real goods, raw materials, government funding, government involvement. And this is something to consider in the years, decades ahead when it comes to investment decisions. Now, each of these metals has an exchange-traded fund that you could purchase should you desire to in the future to gain exposure to these commodities. Also, each of these companies, for example, of course, almost all of them are publicly traded. And that there are also indexes that reflect commodities as a group, including oil and such and such and such. So, things to consider. Am I recommending these investments? Of course not. That you have to consider them relative to your own portfolio. I'm simply suggesting that, unlike in previous years, there is now a concerted geopolitical, national security, economic security purpose, urgency that is now blowing the wind in the sails of the metals and mining industry that will very likely provide a real return in the decades ahead. There also will be a nominal return. Nominal, and the difference between real and nominal is inflation. I don't have to tell anybody that's listening to this right now regarding inflation. Food inflation is dreadful, unbelievable. Here, just in the Cayman Islands. But it's the same around the world. Inflation seems to be a phenomenon that has returned and will be with us for some period of time because it again is in the interests of governments to sacrifice efficiency and low cost of an international supply chain, having our metals refined in China, buying our ore from Russia, and instead sacrifice those costs, that cheapness, in favor of resiliency. Bring the refining closer to the West, perhaps to Mexico, perhaps to Africa. It'll be more expensive. It'll require a lot of infrastructure building, but it'll be more resilient. So you can see how the inflation will be with the economic scene with us for some period of time. Of course, gold and silver, always something to support us in deeply inflationary times. I do work for a metals and mining company that isn't gold and silver, so I am speaking what I do believe in. It's true. But that's the general outlook, ladies and gentlemen. You're going to hear about critical minerals in the decade ahead. Critical minerals. They're going to say this is for the green energy revolution. Fair enough. But the urgency that you hear governments speak of critical minerals is because of national security, economic security purposes. That's going to put wind in the sails of the commodity markets because these are not really going to be critical minerals. They're going to be political minerals. And that's what we need to think of as we observe the Scramble for Africa Part 2. Political minerals, ladies and gentlemen. How can we take advantage of it? Something we'll be talking about week to week, month to month in the years ahead with all my colleagues. It was a pleasure to speak to all of you again. My name is Emil Kalinowski. Please come back again in a fortnight where we'll be discussing micro or macro economic or financial matters, and we can't wait to do it with you. Have a very good day, everybody. Thank you.